Media manipulation. Quote, just look at us. Everything is backwards. Everything is upside down. Doctors destroy health. Lawyers destroy justice. Universities destroy knowledge. Governments destroy freedom. The major media destroys information. And religions destroy spirituality. End quote. Michael Elner. If the mass media, if the mass public can be easily controlled and shaped to think a certain way, isn't it an asset? If adult public attention can be diverted from sensitive matters, isn't that helpful for an agenda of mass control? If it is possible to distract public attention away from the real social issues and onto matters of no real importance, could that not be a useful tool for a subversive New World Order? Those in power know that if a story is not reported by the mainstream media, even a big story, a dramatic one, most people will not believe it. Media professionals know how to engage the public's emotions. They know how to indulge the human desire for cheap thrills with a constant barrage of sex, violence, and all manner of human conflict and depravity. Cynical controllers give people what they want, even in excess, junk food for thought, while depraving them of the essential information they need to make informed decisions. These are the silent weapons of the stealth war. Noam Chomsky demonstrates in his book, Manufacturing Consent, the political economy of the mass media, that the free market economics model of media leads inevitably to generic and narrow reporting. He describes how the U.S. government and its corporate partners exercise control over what we read, see, perceive, and hear. The national media networks profit through advertising revenue. In fact, they can only survive by depending on their close links with other huge corporations whose bottom line is profit. Inevitably, this leads to corporations essentially dictating their choices of broadcast or print information. The result? Mainstream news comes from biased sources, both in the choice of what is aired and the spin placed on the information. Mainstream media, either knowingly or by rationalization, distorts its reporting when the event is perceived as a threat to the moneyed interests. The guardians of our constitutional freedom of speech and freedom of the press have been bought and paid for. Bedrock principles of our democracy are compromised every day on TV, newspapers, and radio. Instead, what we have is a news system that panders to the interests of America's privileged and neglects its duties to objectively inform the public. Public radio and television have been the brave exceptions to this trend because their support has come from small contributions of average citizens, philanthropic foundations, and government grants. However, with that support diminishing in recent years, they too have accepted advertising revenues from major corporations. Nevertheless, their discerning, objective reporting of both sides of an issue, often in depth, continues to offer a choice to viewers, a stark contrast to the superficial sound bites and omission of important stories of the major networks. Noam Chomsky has tracked the amount of time the corporate news media typically devotes to a particular story. A good example was the beginning of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which started in September 2011. During the first week, there was a near complete TV news blackout. In the second week, the protests blossomed at the Federal Reserve Building in San Francisco and a dozen other U.S. cities, but still there was scant national reporting. In the third week of protests, the Chomsky stopwatch clocked in a short 30 seconds on the CBS Evening News, which devoted its main stories to a man who had built his home completely from made in the USA products and Lady Gaga's message to her fans. Both of these stories were allocated 3 minutes. In the fourth week of the Occupy movement, the protests went global with more than 900 meetups in 900 cities worldwide and across America before the story finally got the attention it deserved. Chomsky points out that the key element of social control is the strategy of distraction, diverting public attention away from important issues by flooding the airwaves with trivia, insignificant information, and cheap thrills. This prevents people from focusing on important issues, ongoing real problems, and considering needed changes to bring about solutions. Consider the type of stories given the most prominence. Local network affiliate news outlets often use stories of violence as their lead. In 2010, 2/3 of viewers surveyed who indicated they received their news from TV reported they thought crime was a serious problem. Yet statistics show a general decline in violent crimes across America over the past decade. But this is not the impression portrayed on the local nightly news. Fear-based stories are a dominant theme on TV, news, and dramas virtually every night. Fear is a tried and true psychological tool to shut down the mind. Fear causes confusion, impairs critical thinking, and can immobilize entire groups of people. Superstition peddlers on TV. A standard definition of a vested interest is, quote, any person, group, or entity which prevents or controls communication to serve their own purposes, plans, or agenda, end quote. The status quo position of our government and the media, now largely run by corporate vested interests, has been to protect the people from knowledge it regards as frightening, not credible, irrelevant, and most of all, threatening to their bottom line of money, power, and control. This largely explains what is not told. In fact, the only protection afforded by ignorance and secrecy is to hide the private agenda, these vested interests of those in power seeking to maintain control by regulating the flow of information. By doing so, this technique can disarm every perceived enemy through superstition, disinformation, or ignorance. The best way to enslave someone is to allow that person to believe they are already free. Today, most Americans still believe we have a free press. This fundamental right guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution has been so gradually and cleverly eroded that many Americans have not noticed it. The controllers exert a strong but subtle influence over our lives. One such influence is the constant use of terminology tinged with suspicious overtones and suggestive interpretations, that is, subtle editorializing. Play a little game the next time you watch the network news. See how many times a feel-good story is described as, quote, miraculous. Weather forecasters will say, quote, you might need an umbrella for Sunday services, end quote. Another perennial favorite is the guardian angel news story that runs in the aftermath of any national tragedy. The network news never fails to report on any Jewish or Christian religious holiday, but no other religious group enjoys such attention. There also appears to be great interest in the Pope's activities, with a lead in as such, quote, we now turn to the Vatican, where the Pope says, end quote. On Friday, April 29th, 2011, at least one major network news outlet led with the royal wedding story. Only the day before, a major national disaster hit several southern states, killing hundreds of Americans. This was the worst natural disaster since Hurricane Katrina. Instead of informing the public on the towns and homes destroyed by the largest recorded tornado in history, the feel-good story of Prince William and Catherine Middleton's wedding marriage took priority. When the mega tornado story did run, there was not one mention of global warming, potential Earth changes, geoengineering, or speculation, scientific or otherwise, about what might be contributing to such natural disasters. In this case, the biggest tornado on Earth at the EP5 level, which destroyed everything in its 200-kilometer wide path. This within weeks of another huge tornado that had wiped out large sections of Joplin, Missouri. Instead, all three networks used religious jargon to describe miraculous survival stories. Quote, it was God's will I survived the tornado, end quote, confided one, or, quote, I prayed with confidence in the Lord, end quote. When describing the damage to a church, one reporter led his story with, quote, God did not spare his own house, and later, no services this Sunday in this deeply religious town, end quote. But they did show weather photos of cumulus clouds, observing, quote, it looks like heaven out there, end quote. In the days following, survivor stories were very popular, such as the, quote, Agent of God story, featuring a babysitter that saved an infant by covering him, interpreting this behavior as something other than simply a natural response. Unfree press. Many people think America has the most liberated mass media in the world. The truth is we do not. It is more likely the most expensive press in the world, costly to its citizens who waste time stumbling around in the dark, to say nothing of having to look at alternative sources to be informed. A little research with documents now available since the expansion of the Freedom of Information Act in the mid-1990s, plus clues from other internet sources, reveals that not only is the mass media owned by a select few, but the select few have strategically placed agents from the intelligence community throughout the biggest news media outlets. Their instructions are to kill, alter, or change selected stories. These moles are plugged into the large corporate media outlets worldwide, which, as you've probably guessed, are tied mostly to international corporate and financial interests. If the USA has a media worthy of the First Amendment, Instead of mere shills for private oligarchs and propagandists for government, Americans would be much more advanced as a people and a nation. Those who seek to manipulate the conscious and intelligent opinions of society constitute an invisible government, which is the actual ruling party of America, and by extension, the world. It is they who pull the strings that brainwash the public mind, who harness ancient corrupt strategies while using modern technology to bind and sway public opinion. News reports are dictated from the top down. Anchors are advised to avoid issues such as Israeli aggression, ISIS as a Mossad CIA creation, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, that's AIPAC, the Committee on Foreign Relations, the CFR, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, the Endowment for Middle East Truth, EMET, the Project for the New American Century, PNAC, the MacQuarie Infrastructure Company, MIC, the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergs, and of course 9/11, or anything about the lies behind the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The mass media creates a story by repeating selected talking points and sound bites over and over, such as the war on terror. Corporate interests, both their financial bottom line and what they want people to think, drive the selection of stories. The oil companies are among the biggest advertisers, along with the pharmaceutical companies. These two giant enterprises now account for 70% of the revenue for news shows on TV. It has become very difficult to criticize big oil, pharmaceutical companies, and the war machine in the news, let alone encourage unbiased investigative journalism. A rare exception and a hopeful sign is the airing of two recent stories on 60 Minutes, one detailing the bogus claims of antidepressants, and a few weeks later, an interview of two top Air Force pilots who reported instructions from top brass to continue flying planes that were exuding a mysterious gas which made pilots disoriented and seriously ill. Military top brass stated that they were conscientiously studying the problem, had no solution, but were continuing to order flights with these planes. The pilots reported harassment and threats if they refused to fly these flawed aircraft. The big guns. In 1985, author Eustace Mullins published the book Who Owns the TV Networks?, in which he reveals that the House of Rothschild has the controlling interest in all three major networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, and the news services Reuters and the Associated Press, along with the Weather Channel. Rupert Murdoch and his News Corporation media empire are in close lockstep with the Fox conservative message broadcast worldwide. In total, 6 companies control all the major English-speaking media outlets, including the TV networks, the major newspapers, book and magazine publishing, talk radio stations, and the Hollywood movie studios. From their beginnings, these media giants have attempted to get everyone to think the same way. They have sought to use mainstream media to make up your mind for you, or at least severely reduce the scope of your concerns. Ben Bagdikian's book, The New Media Monopoly, confirms that the mainstream media conglomerates in the U.S. have consolidated down from 50 companies in 1983 to just 5 as of 2004. Those 5 titans of the news media are Time Warner, the Walt Disney Company, Murdoch's News Corporation, Bertelsmann of Germany, and Viacom, formerly CBS. General Electric's NBC follows as a close 6th. These companies often vertically integrate the entire creative process of a film or television show from conception to end distribution, creating an ideal environment for dispensing propaganda. According to Bagdikian, the Big Five manufacture politics and social values. Quote, the media conglomerates have been a major force in creating conservative and far-right politics in this country. They have almost single-handedly, as a group, in their radio and television dominance, produced a coarse and vulgar culture that celebrates the most demeaning characteristics in the human psyche: greed, deceit, and cheating as a legitimate way to win, as in the various reality shows, end quote. At the 1991 Bilderberg Conference held June 6 through 9 in Baden-Baden, Germany, David Rockefeller made the following statement, quote, we are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national auto-determination practiced in past centuries, end quote. This captain of industry is actually stating flatly that the medieval feudal system, mere slaves serving to the whims of the divine rights of kings, is, quote, surely preferable, end quote, to the democracy crafted by the founders of the United States. That David Rockefeller apparently holds this view unapologetically and regards it as rational and even superior is indicative of massive self-deception and sad disassociation from the natural kindness and altruism deep within human nature. The chilling reactions we have to these revelations can be used to bring us to a heightened awareness that we do have choices. We cannot be victimized by these forces without personal consent. You will know what they want you to know. In the service of heightened awareness, readers here are invited to notice other tactics of mind manipulation. In order to create a divided mindset among us, we have been conditioned to think with an us and them attitude. We think of them in terms of religion, race, language, education, patriotism, class, wealth, and every other form of separatism that highlights differences among people. We tend to focus on these differences rather than our similarities. Fortunately, certain authentic older beliefs and the New Age teachings recognize our spiritual oneness, and this has made some corrective inroads. Another manipulative strategy is the catch-all umbrella phrase, quote, for national security purposes, end quote. Many important news stories have a kill switch enabling the powers that be to eliminate any news item deemed a national threat to security, which is actually any stories that might expose their cloak of secrecy. And in this way, the Orwellian newspeak of word collisions can seep into public consciousness through the mass media by deliberately introducing contradictory and impoverished language. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. The elite rulers know that to control the media is to control the public. This is one of their stated agendas. Control of the mass media and financial institutions also open the door to complete domination of law, government, and education. Centralized banking allows a few to dictate their vision to government, military, mass media, education, and industry. The Federal Reserve Bank of the USA, the Federal Reserve Bank of England, the Bank of Roth, the Bank of Germany, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Bank of International Settlements are all privately owned and controlled businesses. Mass media outlets criticize these institutions at their peril. And finally, Hollywood, the entertainment arm of the media, is a natural target. To manipulate this sophisticated group, controllers are less transparent than in the pharmaceuticals foisted on the public with their comical list of side effects. They do not approach a film producer and say, hey, here's our script, and oh, by the way, we're the Illuminati and we want you to make this movie that promotes our agenda. No, instead they will form small investment corporations that fund movies with ideas they choose. The business entities select the scripts they wish to see developed, then hires the producers, directors, and actors. They will never mention their affiliation publicly or reveal their motives, yet they do have a propensity to relish hiding the truth in plain sight. What moviegoers are offered as science fiction, more often than not, is actually science fact. It is constructive to observe how the North Korean government runs its state-owned media. Consider how the people of North Korea have been under the spell, so to speak, of their former dear leader Kim Jong-il and his son, the new successor. At Kim Jong-il's funeral in December 2011, the TV cameras used the transparent device of rotating imagery of crying citizens to convey the false impression of widespread grieving. Since there is no interaction with any neighboring nations, no news from the outside, the North Korean people are manipulated by one source of information, similar to the handful of mass media outlets we have in America. Forces in both countries inform the outlets to stay on message and can doctor stories, as was done with Kim Jong's funeral, or at least focus attention where they want it. TV reporters passively or deliberately doctor their material by crafting everyone thinks stories, implying a general consensus. The message gets repeated by all official news outlets to create a general consensus via groupthink. Seeking to understand the situation, the viewer then repeats the talking points to friends, co-workers, and family, thus perpetuating the propaganda and gradually solidifying the story as true. Never forget that the false reason for preemptive second invasion of Iraq was its possession of weapons of mass destruction, which first entered groupthink as a pure media fabrication via the Pentagon public relations machine. When this was roundly challenged by numerous groups of Americans, including a lengthy UN-sponsored search turning up no such weapons, the Bush administration fell back on the treatment of Iraqi citizens by Saddam Hussein, which could not be defeated as a security risk to the U.S. I should say, which could not be defended as a security risk to the U.S., combined with a vague terrorist threat. In fact, enormous defense contracts won by major corporations needed for destroying a country and then rebuilding it was a major force driving the invasion of Iraq. Corporate overlords. Much of the manipulation described here is psychological conditioning. A psychological matrix similar to George Orwell's 1984 has been created to keep the public in a box. An infiltration of institutions and the media makes mass manipulation fairly easy. Those in power have the ability to float nonsensical stories to confuse people. A carnival of ridiculousness keeps many reasonable, intelligent people off important subjects. So much virulent disinformation has been placed in the public arena that most people cannot distinguish between the truth and lies. An enigma wrapped in a mystery. The emphasis on ideological differences, the removal of nuances, and continuous repetition of simplistic sound bites create low information voters, a newspeak term to describe citizens who remain uninformed on complex issues. The greatest flaw of capitalism and its ultimate downfall will be the insatiable greed that it perpetuates. This is capitalism run amok, as we see in the 1% where wealth is concentrated. People are scared when faced with the idea of lacking what they think they need or what they are told they need. But the idea of never enough or just a little more is the insidious psychological lie which can be our downfall. But there are many small groups, and their numbers are growing, whose members are calling for a halt in the headlong race of rampant individual spending and a return to a simpler life with fewer material possessions. While corporations and the media foster greed and compulsive consumerism, individuals and organizations throughout the U.S. are combating this trend by beginning to wake up to the false never enough attitude and are fostering a downsizing mood instead, along with the idea of sharing resources. How does a corporation lose its moral compass? A corporation run by many people becomes the sum of its parts. As it grows in employees, it accumulates wealth and grows into its own entity. With that power, a company seeks to survive by any means possible. It commissions its own studies to justify its actions. It hires lobbyists to influence politicians. It buys off politicians by making campaign contributions. Wealthy individuals, usually captains of industry, use their money power to influence policy. Every politician relies on money to get elected. Thus, a corporation will continue to push its agenda, no matter how flawed, to ensure survivability. Most individuals within these entities who question policy don't last. Think of how askew the health insurance industry, oil companies, and big tobacco have become. From today's perspective, it is reasonable to suggest that no multinational company should have been allowed to develop in the first place, and now they are behemoths, near mythical monsters. An exaggeration? Just try to kill one. You'd be killing an entire industry, such as offshore drilling, employing thousands. You'd also be killing the sum of its parts. Of the 100 largest economies on the planet, companies and countries, more than half are corporations. ExxonMobil passed up Uruguay in the late 20th century as a larger economic entity. Oil companies employ their own mercenary armies. Governments now serve the corporations rather than the people who elected them, and this is described as fascism, or I call it neo-fascism, a system of government run by corrupt dictatorial authority rather than by individuals freely elected by its citizens. Need further proof that America has become a fascist nation? In 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision called Citizens United that corporations have the same rights as individuals. Quote, "I'll believe a corporation is an individual when Texas execute one," read a sign at the original Occupy Wall Street protest. Speaking for the court majority, Justice Kennedy performed an amazing feat of turning First Amendment rights upside down. He said, quote, "A ban on corporate spending suppressed free speech for nonprofit and for-profit corporations, big and small," end quote. This was the twisted logic which made a corporation into a person, a classic example of doublespeak, raising suspicions of the same insidious manipulation taking place in the highest echelons of justice. On the other hand, Justice Stevens, one of the dissenters, said he believed that, quote, "corporations were not human beings and that this was a distinction that was significant in the context of elections," end quote. He noted with wry understatement, quote, "The interests of corporations may have fundamental conflicts with the interests of the electorate," end quote. This unfortunate 5-4 decision underlies the importance of appointing independent thinkers to the Supreme Court. The insidious influence of the hidden government has spread like a cancer into every area of industrialized society. These tentacles, fueled by money and threats, have moved into everything of importance and influence. They have infiltrated groups ranging from the mafia to Harvard University to international banking. Ominously, they strive to influence every person's mind. They have been largely successful, that is, up to a certain point. Once again, notice the awakening that is occurring. Individuals and groups are spreading the word, person to person and through the internet, nudging each other to remember that our minds are our own. Once again, notice the awakening that is occurring. Individuals and groups are spreading the word, person to person and through the internet, nudging each other to remember that our minds are our own. We have a choice. Our minds are not constrained by our brains and cannot be controlled without our consent. In fact, we have a better idea. We can let go of fear and choose love. That is, love in the highest sense, where it is identical to truth. Those who choose to focus on pure love energy are nearly impossible to penetrate with hate-mongering or fear-based propaganda. This kind of love is the most powerful force in the universe. It grows exponentially when shared. Controlling corporate power. President Teddy Roosevelt, who was willing to stand up to what he called the malefactors of great wealth over a century ago, stated, quote, "These international bankers and Rockefeller Standard Oil interests control the majority of newspapers and the columns of those newspapers to club into submission or drive out of public office officials who refuse to do the bidding of the powerful, corrupt cliques which compose the invisible government," end quote. He in Congress successfully passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had the clout to break up burgeoning corporations and limit the influence of moneyed interests. His administration also passed the graduated income tax that forced corporations and the wealthy to pay their fair share of taxes to operate the country. His administration passed laws that allowed unions to organize, which created a middle class in this country and enabled the prosperity and the stability that made American democracy the envy of the world. Congress created, among other things, direct election of senators, and in 1907, a law passed that forbade corporate contributions to federal political office holders or federal political candidates. The achievements of the Teddy Roosevelt administration have been reversed in the 100 years since the antitrust acts were passed. Now, even the Supreme Court appears to have lost its constitutional moorings. The opinions of Alito, Scalia, Roberts, and Clarence Thomas regularly favor the rights of corporations over the rights of individuals. In fact, even if it's a corporation versus the government, the corporation wins. We have a Supreme Court which overruled a duly elected president in favor of a puppet controlled by elite moneyed interests. Finally, as described above, we have a Supreme Court which has in effect repealed a 100-year-old law prohibiting corporations from contributing to federal political candidates. It is now legal for the first time in a century for corporations to flood our federal political campaigns with a tsunami of money through political action committees, or super PACs, as many Americans see this as the beginning of the end of representative government. To continue a brief American history survey, the Fairness Doctrine, passed in 1928, stipulated that the airwaves belonged to the public. Broadcasters had to be licensed to use them, but only if they did so to inform the public, promote the public interest, and advance democracy. This spawned the beginning of the 6 o'clock nightly news. The networks didn't want it then, and even now devote only a half hour to national and international news, with the exception of public broadcasting. Networks didn't want to spend time on news because news departments were chronic money losers, but they were forced to broadcast the news at 6 p.m., and even today, the news on music radio stations is an artifact of the Fairness Doctrine. Congress asserted that if media outlets were using the airwaves to broadcast, they had an obligation to fairly inform the public. The other rule was to avoid corporate consolidation and control. Both rules are now lost. Revoking the Fairness Doctrine. The de-evolution of the American press began in 1987 when President Ronald Reagan abolished the Fairness Doctrine. Once again, in a kind of upside-down thinking, Mark S. Fowler the new FCC chair under the Reagan administration, stated that the Fairness Doctrine violated First Amendment rights by giving government undue control over free speech. In a flurry of debate, a district court of appeals also undermined the statute by arguing that it was not actually a binding law, citing a faulty amendment. Nevertheless, Congress overwhelmingly passed a law to reinstate the Fairness Doctrine, but Reagan vetoed the law, and only later, a later effort was threatened with a veto by President George Herbert Walker Bush. To the list of Orwellian newspeak can be added, freedom is unfairness. Perhaps unwittingly, Reagan did away with the diversity and the multiplicity of control. He vetoed the Fairness Doctrine as a favor to the Christian right, which helped him get elected. And they wanted to take over all of AM radio, which is now complete. Talk radio is 95% controlled by the right and the big studio heads who helped Reagan get elected. Their goal was consolidation of the media giants. Rupert Murdoch was also complicit in helping Ronald Reagan repeal the Fairness Doctrine, which has since essentially allowed Fox, F-A-U-X, News to tell whopper lies on the air. Media ethics have deteriorated so much that the Florida State Supreme Court ruled it is now legal for Fox to lie during the TV news. A recent example is Fox News being sued in Florida by its own journalists because they were being asked to lie on the news. The issue was a story they researched about the manufacture by Monsanto of a possible carcinogen, a recombinant bovine growth hormone, that's RBGH, shown in some studies to be toxic and was routinely injected into cattle. According to the two reporters who brought the story to suit and later were fired, their complaint was not that they couldn't air the story. Quote, Fox 13 didn't want to kill the story revealing synthetic hormones in Florida milk supply, they said. Instead, as we explain in great detail in our legal complaint, we were repeatedly ordered to go forward and broadcast demonstrably inaccurate and dishonest versions of the story. We were given those instructions after some very high-level corporate lobbying by Monsanto, that's the powerful drug company that makes the hormone, and also, we believe, by members of Florida's dairy and grocery outlet industries, end quote. The journalists were outraged because Fox protected its corporate sponsor, Monsanto, and its Roundup ad, condoning misinformation which could affect the safety of children who drink milk. Fox and Monsanto won the case when the Supreme Court of Florida declared it was not unlawful to lie on TV broadcasts, because in the end, Monsanto's commercial advertising paid for the news. Fox News is not allowed to broadcast in Canada because the Canadians still have a Fairness Doctrine. It's illegal to lie on the air in Canada. England also has similar rules, as do most countries in Europe. But in the United States, we have lost the Fairness Doctrine, and as a result, we know a lot about Lindsay Lohan's gradual emotional collapse and are aware of Justin Bieber's sex life, but we do not know much about controlling the weather or the causes of the megastorms that are only increasing in severity. The controllers operate from the disdainful premise that average Americans will behave like sheep. They believe voters are simple-minded and want only pat answers, such as government is bad, taxes too high, free markets know best, jobs, jobs, jobs. This is termed confirmation bias, and more people are noticing that it keeps us in ideological trenches. It is red meat spoon-fed. A growing number of Americans are suspicious of condensed data in the form of sound bites, recognizing that key information is lost in its reduction. While the controllers are not yet home free, the challenges Americans face to regain lost freedoms are formidable. To recap, today we have 6 giant corporations that control virtually all 14,000 radio stations in our country, all 2,200 television stations, 80% of our newspapers, the majority of our billboards, and most of the largest internet content providers. When it comes right down to it, there are a few individuals deciding what most Americans receive as news. In their corporate culture, the overriding obligation is to the shareholders. They seem to have lost sight of an obligation to serve the public interest by broadcasting useful information in a democracy in which people vote for programs in the best interest of the republic. What a quaint notion. Rather, they provide what they perceive we are asking for: entertainment. It is sad Americans are the best entertained and the least informed people in the Western world. We spend more time talking about Taylor Swift than discussing what's really about to destroy our democracy, which is a huge flood of corporate money into the political spectrum, as we see in the 2016 presidential race. The super PACs empower corporations even more, to the point where unseen donors can now make or break a political opponent. And now the Supreme Court recognizes a corporation as an individual with the same inherent constitutional rights and powers of an American citizen. Appealing to the reptilian brain, Robert Kennedy Jr. articulated our dilemma in his interview with Tavis Smiley on public television. Quote, "Our mass media today is designed to appeal to the prurient interest that all of us have in the reptilian core of our brains for sex and celebrity gossip. There has been a sharp decrease in investigative reporting on important matters. 85% of investigative reporters lost their jobs in the last 2 decades. The networks discarded their foreign news bureaus. As a result, the Bush and Cheney administration were able to say to the American people, oh, we're going to go into this 800-year-old fistfight in Mesopotamia, and they're going to meet us with rose petals in the streets. And the American public believed them, while the rest of the world saw the second U.S. invasion of Iraq as unjust and illegal." End quote. To recap, do you remember when real reporters existed? Those were the days before the Clinton regime concentrated the media into a few hands and turned the media into a ministry of propaganda, a tool of Big Brother. Consider a review of ways we have colluded, often unaware, in these alarming developments, and a reminder of our way out. As a member of the human collective consciousness, most of us are choosing a negative polarization by default, by the quality of our unmindful thoughts and actions. The stealthy conversation of information into fear is a primary tactic of the mass media. Ever since Washington Post investigative reporter Carl Bernstein revealed in 1977 that the CIA was making a comprehensive effort to control the media, we have known the stories that actually do make it out to a mass audience have been vetted, edited, and sanitized by the powers that be. And since virtually everything the CIA does is hidden behind the cloak of national security, who then is accountable for deciding what vital information we are allowed to receive? Or perhaps more importantly, what we are not allowed to receive? Thought is creative energy focused. We get exactly what we put out. Control of the mass media is vitally important to the ruling elite because of its hypnotic powers. We as a society in our comatose state, despite our free will, in many ways have consented to the state of our planet today. We saturate our minds with the unhealthy dishes served up for us on television that are really a form of addiction. Violence, pornography, greed, hatred, selfishness, incessant bad news, fear-mongering, and terror are popular media compulsive addictions. The use of television flashes are employed as mental impulses, which on a subliminal level make us agitated. Guns, blood, and actors playing terrified character roles are a common lure for upcoming TV shows. When was the last time you stopped just to think of something beautiful and pure? The planet is the way it is because of our collective thoughts about it. We are complicit in not noticing our projections and in our own inaction every time we look the other way when we see an injustice. Thus, we are feeding into the general negativity. It is very important to the controllers of the media that the polarization of this planet remains negative. That means passively condoning our old habits of selfish preoccupation as opposed to positive service to others. We can begin to break these negative habits by taking time to be quiet and access our inner guide, the wise decision maker. This decision to first turn inward wrests control from seeming outsiders, the mistaken idea that we are victims, and returns control to where it has always been, within, with our choices. From accessing our own higher wisdom and coming from a healing intention, we are able to diminish negativity and fear, and the love and compassion that remains will guide our actions in service to others and the planet.